The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, when some 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army poured across the 38th parallel, the boundary between the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Republic of Korea to the north and the pro-Western Republic of Korea to the south. This invasion was the first military action of the Cold War. By July, American troops had entered the war on South Korea's behalf. As far as American officials were concerned, it was a war against the forces of international communism itself. After some early back and forth across the 38th parallel, the fighting stalled and casualties mounted with nothing to show for them. Meanwhile, American officials worked anxiously to fashion some sort of armistice with the North Koreans. The alternative, they feared, would be a wider war with Russia and China, or even, as some warned, World War III. Finally, in July 1953, the Korean War came to an end. In all, some 5 million soldiers and civilians lost their lives in what many in the US refer to as the Forgotten War for the lack of attention it received compared to more well-known conflicts like World War I and II and the Vietnam War. The Korean Peninsula remains divided today. If the best minds in the world had set out to find us the worst possible location in the world to fight this damnable war, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, 1893 to 1971, once said, the unanimous choice would have been Korea. The peninsula had landed in America's lap almost by accident. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Korea had been a part of the Japanese Empire, and after World War II it fell to the Americans and the Soviets to decide what should be done with their enemies' imperial possessions. In August 1945, two young aides at the State Department divided the Korean peninsula in half along the 38th parallel. The Russians occupied the area north of the line and the United States occupied the area to its south. Did you know? Unlike World War II and Vietnam, the Korean War did not get much media attention in the United States. The most famous representation of the war in popular culture is the television series MASH, which was set in a field hospital in South Korea. The series ran from 1972 until 1983, and its final episode was the most watched in television history. By the end of the decade, two new states had formed on the peninsula. In the south, the anti-communist dictator Syngman Rhee, 1875 to 1965, enjoyed the reluctant support of the American government. In the north, the communist dictator Kim Il-sung, 1912 to 1994, enjoyed the slightly more enthusiastic support of the Soviets. Neither dictator was content to remain on his side of the 38th parallel, however, and border skirmishes were common. Nearly 10,000 North and South Korean soldiers were killed in battle before the war even began. Even so, the North Korean invasion came as an alarming surprise to American officials. As far as they were concerned, this was not simply a border dispute between two unstable dictatorships on the other side of the globe. Instead, many feared it was the first step in a communist campaign to take over the world. For this reason, non-intervention was not considered an option by many top decision makers. In fact, in April 1950, a National Security Council report known as NSC 68 had recommended that the United States use military force to contain communist expansionism anywhere it seemed to be occurring, regardless of the intrinsic strategic or economic value of the lands in question. If we let Korea down, President Harry Truman, 1884 to 1972, said, the Soviets will keep right on going and swallow up one place after another. The fight on the Korean Peninsula was a symbol of the global struggle between East and West, good and evil, in the Cold War. As the North Korean army pushed into Seoul, the South Korean capital, the United States readied its troops for a war against communism itself. At first, the war was a defensive one to get the communists out of South Korea, and it went badly for the Allies. The North Korean army was well disciplined, well trained and well equipped. Rhee's forces in the South Korean army, by contrast, were frightened, confused and seemed inclined to flee the battlefield at any provocation. Also, it was one of the hottest and driest summers on record, and desperately thirsty American soldiers were often forced to drink water from rice paddies that had been fertilized with human waste. As a result, dangerous intestinal diseases and other illnesses were a constant threat. By the end of the summer, President Truman and General Douglas MacArthur, 1880 to 1964, the commander in charge of the Asian Theater, had decided on a new set of war aims. Now, for the Allies, the Korean War was an offensive one. It was a war to liberate the North from the Communists. Initially, this new strategy was a success. The Incheon landing, an amphibious assault at Incheon, pushed the North Koreans out of Seoul and back to their side of the 38th parallel. But as American troops crossed the boundary and headed north toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and Communist China, the Chinese started to worry about protecting themselves from what they called armed aggression against Chinese territory. Chinese leader Mao Zedong, 1893-1976, sent troops to North Korea and warned the United States to keep away from the Yalu boundary unless it wanted full-scale war. This was something that President Truman and his advisors decidedly did not want. They were sure that such a war would lead to Soviet aggression in Europe, the deployment of atomic weapons and millions of senseless deaths. To General MacArthur, however, anything short of this wider war represented appeasement, an unacceptable knuckling under to the Communists. As President Truman looked for a way to prevent war with the Chinese, MacArthur did all he could to provoke it. Finally, in March 1951, he sent a letter to Joseph Martin, a House Republican leader who shared MacArthur's support for declaring all-out war on China and who could be counted upon to leak the letter to the press. There is, MacArthur wrote, no substitute for victory against international communism. For Truman, this letter was the last straw. On April 11th, the president fired the general for insubordination. In July 1951, President Truman and his new military commanders started peace talks at Panmunjom. Still, the fighting continued along the 38th parallel as negotiations stalled. Both sides were willing to accept a ceasefire that maintained the 38th parallel boundary, but they could not agree on whether prisoners of war should be forcibly repatriated. The Chinese and the North Koreans said yes, the United States said no. Finally, after more than 2 years of negotiations, the adversaries signed an armistice on July 27, 1953. The agreement allowed the POWs to stay where they liked, drew a new boundary near the 38th parallel that gave South Korea an extra 1,500 square miles of territory, and created a 2-mile-wide demilitarized zone that still exists today. The Korean War was relatively short but exceptionally bloody. Nearly 5 million people died. More than half of these, about 10% of Korea's pre-war population, were civilians. This rate of civilian casualties was higher than World War II's and the Vietnam Wars. Almost 40,000 Americans died in action in Korea, and more than 100,000 were wounded. Today, they are remembered at the Korean War Veterans Memorial near the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., a series of 19 steel statues of servicemen, and the Korean War Memorial in Fullerton, California, the first on the West Coast to include the names of the more than 30,000 Americans who died in the war.